Hi everybody, thank you for coming. So I'm going to take you through a series of works probably covering since the early 2000s, and that kind of marks a time when I returned back to Wales. I'm from South Wales originally, but living in Snowdonia now, and well, basically 20 years ago, after living in Southampton and Todmorden in West Yorkshire, Jill and I, my partner Jill and I, decided to come back to Wales. And so I've used that, as I say, as the starting point and to give a little bit of a sort of timeline to it. I've also decided to reference the idea of collaboration to a degree, because that's been very much part of our conversation during the residency time. And I think there have been a number of residencies that I've been a part of over the years where, you know, what I've actually got from that is being able to discuss ideas with each other, and also at times to literally work with other people on actual work. So I'll just reference some of that. And it's something that I'm certainly interested in doing more of during this time as part of the project that Veronica has set up. So I'll just sort of run through. So just to start with, okay, try the mouse. Okay, yeah. So I'm starting with, as I say, right at the early 2000s. And when I was first coming back to South Wales, I was very much linked to Swansea Print Workshop and Cardiff Print Workshop. And something that I first got involved with is Contemporary Welsh Printmakers exchange show with Pakistan and Wales. And so I've just selected a few pieces. It's really interesting. I hadn't thought about this when I was beginning to put it together, about the group of us here as printmakers. But I believe that's Paul Croft on the front cover there. I didn't make the front cover, but I made the inside page, the next inside page. And so I picked these two pieces as well as a starting point to some of the common themes and also the ways that I enjoy working. These are collograph prints, and I quite enjoy working with fragmented plates and also themes of connections to the land in maybe a more abstracted way, or stories and associations with the land. Earth Vessel came about through some research that I'd done on Llyncerrig Bach, the lake in Anglesey that really has connections with Iron Age votive offerings. And I just became really interested in the kind of the whole concept of that idea of offerings to the land, and the kinds of the ideas of rituals surrounding that. And that kind of comes through some of the work later on as well. So part of the early work, I was actually spending time between Snowdonia and South Wales to begin with, half the year or thereabouts. And the forest at Cyd-fyw that Jill has already mentioned was a very sort of fertile ground for me. And just going out into the forest and observing the bark, the splitting of the bark, just really the microcosm of the forest there. And these became the inspiration for these pieces. And again, still very interested in working with torn plates, fragmented plates, and then the idea of working with light and dark and the human condition as well. So they have this sort of kind of connection to sort of inner worlds and outer worlds. This is a selection of 4, but this was an original series of 12 as part of this. Working with blind embossing, which is on the right-hand side there, just enjoying creating areas that the ink doesn't go into the page or the print. I think it gives this idea for me, these sort of impressions that may be left. And this seems to be something that I'm drawn back to all of the time, this idea of traces on the land, like a palimpsest. So that often crops up as well. And again, with cleave, just taking sections, cutting plates up, putting them back together. So an idea of deconstruction and construction often comes through as well. And these are both collagraphs. Okay. So one of the first collaborations or connections came about through my connections with the Regional Print Centre in Wrexham. Again, in the sort of mid-2000s, I sort of sort of did a 2-year professional printmaking course at the print centre with Stephen Jones-Hughes, and that's really where I met Alison and Veronica. Alison on the course and Veronica as a visiting artist, so we all go back quite a long way. And we did a project together called the Cael, and it was between Welsh and Irish artists, and Veronica as a sort of honorary Welsh artist. And we did a residency at Cilraleig in the far west of Ireland. It's an amazing place. You get your own cottage, as you can see, and we went as, I can't quite remember the number, but at least 7, if not more, printmakers. And 7, yeah, it was an amazing time. And then we had, there's a community house as well, and we sort of set up small printmaking areas. But as you can see, we had our own small studios. So that was a really interesting connection and collaboration. And what happened there as well, we were twinned with a particular Irish artist, as a Welsh artist, and we spent time over a number of years developing connections. I was twinned with an author called Eileen Keane, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in the next works. So Eileen was very interested and inspired by Mold's Bog, very close to where she lived, and its history of burial rituals. And, you know, it was also very much inspiration for poets such as Seamus Heaney. And we also reflected very much on our backgrounds, with her father being very involved in peat cutting and working on the bog, and my own father and grandfathers on my maternal and paternal side being coal miners. So we were interested in kind of the industrial aspects of land, but certainly at this point we were looking at sort of just spending time at particular locations, and we sort of spent time, as I say, very much looking at sort of Mold's Bog and around that area. And what we were doing as well at this point was actually working on each other's work. So I've just given you, there are many examples, but I've just given you a small selection for this presentation. And so, for instance, I would have sent over a number of prints or given them to Eileen, the ones on the left-hand side there, and then she's kind of worked on them further. And we did this with a whole number of works. So that was a very interesting experience, actually working on somebody else's work. It's sort of quite a challenging thing to have somebody take over your work and add to it, sometimes obliterating it, but you know, it was an interesting experience. And then other work came much more sort of collaboratively, in the sense that we shared stories and sketchbooks and working pages. So, okay. And these were slightly different ones where, as I say, it was much more kind of taking all sorts of working drawings together. And offering and bog butter came about through, bog butter is sort of found in bogs as well. And again, we were talking about offerings, things that were found in bogs, ritual, sacrificial subject matter like bog bodies. We visited the bog bodies in the museum in Ireland, and we were both very interested in that sort of subject matter. So I'll work. Yeah. So these came, this ritual 1 and ritual 2, these were my particular prints, but again based on conversations with Eileen, and these came from a Seamus Heaney poem, and the ritual 1 is all featured in one of Seamus Heaney's poems, sort of Tollan Man, and there are all kinds of other areas that bog bodies were found. I found through research in Scandinavia, in Denmark, in Ireland. It was really interesting to actually discover that this sort of ritual was happening all over, you know, many areas, and this idea of sort of consecrating the ground. So research took me into sort of maybe looking at the idea and discovering that perhaps these bog bodies were ritual sacrificial activities to appease fertility, the fertility goddess, the idea that Iron Age bogs were the gateways to the spiritual world. At the same time in Wales, because I was in Snowdonia at this time, I was looking at and thinking about also sort of like the slate industry, although my interest would have been also in the coal and coal mining. At this particular time, I was spending time, this was some work that came about through spending time at Llanberis Slate Museum, and I've taken rubbings from markings that were left there, and some of the kind of other imagery behind are based on ephemera and research from Bangor Museum. And I was looking at the idea of kind of, again, really the impact of slate mining, and these came from, the one on the left was from a newspaper article about the many accidents that happened and the lives that were lost through really quite dangerous working conditions in the slate mines. And the one on the right, fragment 2, is a small piece of a card. It's actually you can't, obviously I've deliberately just taken a section, but the word that is actually there is bradwr, and the whole saying, I'll just say it in English, is "there are no traitors in this house." And this was put up as a card to signify the quarrymen who, you know, basically were not traitors, not actually going into work. It was part of the Penrhyn quarry strike. And there was of the 1900 to 1903. And when this card came out of the window, it would signify that they'd gone back to work. And there was a lot of parallels for me. You know, my whole family were very much involved in the miners' strikes in the 80s, and they were very much part of the families who very much lived hand to mouth during that time and lived on, you know, bags of food given by neighbours and, you know, all the money that was raised. So it was very sort of kind of close to my heart, and further research, as I say, I saw a lot of parallels in that. Okay. And then kind of moving on and thinking about a sense of place. I spend time in New York each year, except for the last couple of years, usually about a month or so. And again, the idea of sort of markings and tracings, something that very much came up as part of the Irish project, was the idea of sort of place, a sense of place, belonging, and the concept of filltir sgwâr, square mile. It could be literally the square mile, or maybe just that sense of your stomping ground, or even for me, it became like a claimed space, my claimed sort of filltir sgwâr or beyond. And I decided to sort of take this idea into a sort of an urban environment to a degree. During my time in New York, it's usually a time that I like to spend doing the research. I'm a member of 2 print centres there, Manhattan Graphic Centre and Robert Blackburn Centre. And I often use part of that as looking at sort of new techniques, or just, you know, just a different experience. And at this time, I was taking this idea of this sort of filltir sgwâr, my actual route to the studio, which I was working at Manhattan Graphic Studio at the time, which went down 72nd Street and then carried on through a subway and beyond. But one thing that always struck me was the street markings, and I sort of became really obsessed, and they became quite beautiful to me. And this idea that these really quite ugly markings had a thing of beauty to them. And I was quite struck sometimes, and I've just given a selection here, how similar the markings were from the natural environment in Snowdonia for me, from what I was actually recording, and then these from an urban environment. So I've just sort of given a selection here. And I used these partly for a series of wood lithography prints I did, Mocolito, with Eva Budka, who was very much pioneers Mocolito at the time. So I sort of worked on these of a series of a couple of weeks. So I've just put some of those in. So this is me in Manhattan Graphic Studio, and this is a series of the Mocolito prints that came from those. So I was sort of using these kind of markings just to create my own interpretations. I wasn't trying to recreate the street markings. I was sort of working through a different sort of palette of colours, which I often work with just in black. So it's sort of quite interesting just to sort of play around with that. And then the idea of, although it's an urban street, I was very, again, my walks on this sort of 72nd Street at night coming back, I was coming back in the evening, usually doing sort of quite many hours throughout the afternoon into the evening. I loved working in the evening in the studio. And then the kind of the lights that are, the shadows. And I was thinking very much about that kind of, that little bit of nature in the urban background. So this lithography print on the right there, just on 72nd Street, that's just one of a selection. So I've just given some of the photographs then I was taking and just coming along and snapping photos as I was walking. I'm just noticing the time is 2 minutes.
Maybe
so.
Carry on,
Mm-hmm.
And we'll do, if the time runs out, we'll be back in the other meeting and the link should still work. So if it cuts out, just rejoin and we'll let you in. And
okay.
Linda can carry on.
Okay. So moving back to Snowdonia, I'm working back in Wales. So again, working between the sort of the two environments and coming back to Wales. The forest, again, very much something I always return to. And the next series came through just going out and working from taking sketchbooks out, working in inks, and I'm just going to show a series of prints that came through those. So these are part of a series called Transients. So I'll just take you through these, and I just wanted to use these also as the idea of something that I rather like doing is to work with single images, but at times then bring those together in multiples and create sort of a different sense of them. And the idea with these came about through larger ink drawings, which I then again deconstructed, and they became more abstract for me, but for me they still felt like sort of you know, elements of the land. I'm never really trying to create a particular landscape or a recognizable landscape, but again, just maybe my experience in that. And then these became part of a triptych that I showed with the Manhattan Graphic Center. So I'm sort of an honorary American here. That became part of USA and Iceland. I won't attempt to pronounce the Icelandic print center. I don't know if anybody is Icelandic and can repeat, but anyway, that was part of that. And so that was an interesting thing as well. So just sort of, just to moving on, just finish, to take it a little bit further. So this, just before the pandemic, 2019 as well, this was an exhibition with Noel Griffiths, who was here. And we basically live on the same land, and we shared this exhibition as our response to where we actually live at Cyd-fyw. Noel showed her artist books and wall-based works, and so did I. And I'm just going to focus on the artist books rather than the wall-based works for this part, just to give you a kind of flavour of some of the other work. So that was part of the cabinet there. So again, part of what I enjoy working with is sort of photography as well as drawing-based works. And this came through a series of observations of, again, using reflection, shadows, and then playing with the idea of sort of containers. So containers in the forms of books or other kinds of things that you could use. And I'd kind of found these sort of glass container, these glass pieces that I have, and I thought I would actually try those and just play with that kind of reflective quality. This small little vintage book here by Wooden Stream. So I come across this. This is a tiny little book in the palm, you know, it really sits in the palm of your hand. And I really love this idea of it being sort of like a companion sort of pocket book. And this, again, coming from walks around the lake nearby from me, a real kind of common walk that I take. And you might be able to see that in the screen, there are these stitched pieces, these sort of like marks, crosses, each signifying a place along that walk of significance for me. This idea of perhaps these desire lines, these sort of spots of areas. And then that's something I actually quite like using stitch in certain pieces of work. This is a solar plate and blind embossing. And again, rather than, like I said earlier on, the idea of blind embossing to give impression. Convergence, taking again prints and sort of deconstructing these. I sort of really enjoy the idea that they become their own kind of narrative and story. They feel very different. So from what was, originally one image becomes a completely different set of images, and each section could be read differently. And I'm really happy for the viewer to kind of read their own interpretation. They often create different kinds of sort of almost more traditional landscape. It's not my intention, but I can see how some people see that. And then again, thinking about collaboration, the following two books came about through a collaboration between myself and Jill, who was here earlier, A Path Through the Trees. And this sort of reflected on a time in the forest when it was part of a harvesting program where the landscape changed quite dramatically. And we did this as a series of two books, and we did it through Jill writing and then me responding to the writing, to the words. And then we did a second companion book where we did it the opposite way round. And we produced these two books as a series of that. So I'll sort of just go through these as imagery. I appreciate, maybe there are words that you would like to read, but I'll put more detail of these on my Instagram page for those who might be interested in seeing further the connection with the words and images. So I'll go through these to give you a sense of them. Okay. Paul Croft talked just the other night about lockdown and just going back to drawing, and I found myself very much feeling the same way. And so I've just finished with just going through a little bit of that with you. I found myself really wanting to go back, keeping things really very simple and taking sketchbooks out into the land. And I love working with my own handmade brushes. And I very much thought something to work with was actually creating my own inks. And I spent sort of quite a bit of research time on that, looking at creating inks from what I could find in the forest, barks, oak galls, anything that was perhaps within my sort of square mile, and also creating my own crayons as well from earth pigment and various other, I love to work with kind of rub-ins and creating sort of marks that way. So that became kind of a really lovely part of that time. Part of my favourite way to sort of go out and sketch is just to take these simple concertina type formats and work with some of either the handmade inks or other inks, and just going into the forest, into the pathways, not necessarily finding areas that I wanted, or sometimes intentionally going into kind of areas that I wouldn't think of going, just to sort of see what comes from it, and sort of finding it really kind of quite an interesting meditation on that sort of space and landscape. There are kind of figurative elements, but again, these are all works in progress, and at a later stage I might take sections of these and possibly abstract, combine. Who knows what might happen from those. So I've used that as an idea of taking into sort of the kind of residency time. So obviously since this started with getting the invite from Veronica, talking about the idea of the uses of land from the beginning, after the summer from this September, I did spend a week on Bardsey Island on Ynys Enlli during for about 5, 6, 7 days. And again, just works in progress, sort of sketchbooks that came, taking rub-ins. I was actually staying next to the graveyard there, and I did spend quite a bit of time doing rub-ins and working with inks around that, apart from other types of works. And I love text as well as other imagery, and text often comes into work, so I just thought I would share some of those. And again, these are all works in progress. They might come forward into this current project or not. During the residency for the first few days, it's been really lovely to have Jill doing writing sessions each morning. And this was part of the alert aloneness session on the first day that Jill talked about, going down into places and having worked from kind of the idea of pools and reflections. Something in this sort of caught my eye, and I sort of actually started to work with these. I did actually take quite a lot of photographs and videos. There was an amazing sort of sense of movement, which I haven't got in these photos, but hopefully when the videos are done, and I'll put those on Instagram. But there was an amazing sense of movement, transition, and hopefully they'll make their way into some work. We talked, we did sort of a series of warm-up words on the second day, just choosing from those, and one of the words was boundary. And it was quite interesting that we were asked to choose 3 words, and the one word that every single one of us chose was boundary, and we shared that. And that, when we went into the walk up to the slate mine, very much kind of lived in me for certainly that first part of the walk. Now this is just 3 that I took, and I thought it was kind of quite interesting, certainly in one of the photos there, where nature's becoming part of that boundary and wrapping itself around those slate posts, and there were sort of many others, and again just collating imagery at this moment. But the collaboration of discussion with the other artists here has been really interesting, and I think that's what's become really rich at the moment and really fruitful. So collaboration in perhaps imagery, but also in discussion. And then working back in the studio, we've had litho stones and aluminium litho stones to work on, as well as our own drawings. So just bringing imagery back, and I just started working with the rock pool idea. And again, for me, this sort of vessel, containered shape just draws me back. There is so much symbolism in this kind of vessel and this holding of space. And obviously I could say so much more about that. But it's just something that draws me back. So at the moment, I'm sort of just playing with that idea of putting that imagery within that containered shape. Whether it will stay there yet, I'm not quite sure. I have started creating a litho plate with this particular shape, and others have been more abstracted. And this is just me sort of working with the inks and just experimenting with the tush and the crayon and the litho, and that sort of beautiful reticulation that you get with litho materials. And I find I sort of really love that in other handmade inks. There's a granular quality to, for instance, if you combine oak gall ink with sort of iron, and you get that kind of graininess. So I love that combination between the two. So I will end there. If you want to find more ongoing information for this project with myself, I'll be using probably my Instagram account primarily at lindadavis.inc. I've included Jill's blog website as well, or if you just put Jill Teague and blog, you will find this. So hopefully that's just a bit of information just in terms of finding us afterwards. Okay, thank you.